Liberties has asked me to make her apologies today because she's ill, and so she's unable to join us. And I think most of you who regularly attend our presentation will know that today our presentation is our way of commemorating March 21st, which is the United Nations International Day for the elimination of racial discrimination, a day set aside to commemorate the Sharpeville massacre in 1960 in South Africa. So thank you very much for joining us for this event. Now, it is my it's my distinct pleasure and honor to be able to introduce our guest speaker today. Our guest speaker is Dr. Carl James, and Dr. James holds the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community and Diaspora in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto. He's the Senior Advisor in Equity and Representation in the Office of the Vice President of Equity, People and Culture. Carl's research interests include examination of the schooling and educational experiences, performance, and trajectories of racialized youth. And in his work on equity and inclusivity, he explores the ways in which race and its intersection with gender, class, citizenship, and other identity constructs mediated by accessible and equitable opportunities account for the lived experiences and attainment of Black and other racialized Canadians, particularly Black youth. On March 15th this year, Carl was awarded the Canadian Council for the Arts Killam Prize for Social Sciences. His recent book is called Color Matters, Essays on the Experiences, Education, and Pursuits of Black Youth. In 2017, Carl co-produced the first community-led study capturing the perspectives of Black community members, parents, students, and educators about issues of inequity. That study has been used to influence government educational policies and programs throughout Canada. So, Carl, we're looking forward to your talk today. I was very intrigued by the JEDI, and then I looked at the subtitles. Thought, ooh, he's going to be talking something about Star Wars.
Thanks very much. By the way, the title has changed again somewhat.
Oh dear. Okay.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this discussion. And I think I'm looking forward to the conversation and look forward to engaging, and all of us engaging in a fulsome conversation about some of the points I made. So since sending in the title JEDI, J-E-D-I, I also changed it to J-E-D-I-D, or it could be changed to J-E-D-D-I, JEDI or JEDI or JEDID. And those words mean justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and the other word that I did not have in mind when I first sent it in and since changed is decolonization. So I want us to, and I'm going to introduce the idea of decolonization because I'm thinking of, if we're going to really talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice, we have to think about how that's being done in a decolonized context or decolonizing context, or we have to be in the process of decolonizing if we're going to reach to equity in the Canadian society. So I don't have PowerPoints since so I'm going to read, and of course you can You can send any chat messages, any chat questions, or you can stop me as I go along as you see fit. But I don't want you to be restricted to just hearing. I'm hoping that I can have a conversation, do this in about half an hour or less or more, slightly more. But I'm hoping that afterwards we have this from discussion with some of the points I made. I'm going to leave some of the points open deliberately. So the topic is justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization, and the risk and cost of allyship. So the idea, are we ready for them? And so the idea is to talk about what does equity, diversity, decolonization, and justice, what do they mean? What do they include? And what's the risk of us doing so if we're going to approach these as allies? And I'll get into the discussion, what does it mean to be an ally? And the other question I'll leave for us for an open conversation is, are we ready for the risks and costs of being an ally, and what are they, and how are we going to deal with that? So those are some of the questions I expect us we come to in that discussion. So I'll start now. Canada's Employment Equity Act was passed in 1986 by the Mulroney government, and it took effect in 1987. So employment equity has been an official government operation operating in Canada for 35 years now. The new Employment Equity Act received assent, so that was 1986, and then there was a new Employment Equity Act that was introduced and had royal assent in December 1995. The Act and its regulations subsequently came into force on October 24th, 1996. So creating a new legislative framework for employment equity that governs both private and public sector employees under federal jurisdiction. These employers must comply to all requirements of the Act that was introduced in 1996. So the Employment Equity Act is the law that promotes equity in the workplace, ensures that all employees receive equal opportunities, and that employees are treated fairly by their employers. The law is supposed to protect workers from unfair treatment and any form of discrimination. The purpose of the Act is to, quote, achieve equality in the workplace so that no person shall be denied employment opportunities or benefits for reasons unrelated to ability, and to correct the conditions of disadvantage in employment experienced by women, Aboriginal peoples, we can say indigenous peoples, persons with disability, and members of visible minorities. By giving effect to the principle that employment equity means more than treating persons in the same way, but also requires special measures and accommodation of differences. And that's important to underline, the special measures and the combination of differences. And in time, I'll talk about equity versus inequality. So Judge Abella, who in 1984 was heading the commission report on equity, she wrote, ignoring differences and refusing to accommodate them is denial of equal access and opportunity. It is discrimination. To reduce discrimination, we must create and maintain barrier-free environments so that individuals can have genuine access, free from arbitrary objections, to demonstrate and to exercise their full potential. I start with that historical background. So today, some 35 years of supposedly practicing employment equity in Canada, we're still grappling with bringing about real equity workplaces and having workforces and university students that are representative of the Canadian population. So too, we have employment equity or in some cases, affirmative action policies and programs in workplace and in many unionized workplaces. Nevertheless, within the past 1.5 years, specifically since the death of George Floyd in the United States and assertions of the Black Lives Matter movement that we're seeing in universities, businesses, and organizations, they're taking action to hire, promote, and offer opportunities for racialized people and Black people in particular. So what has been happening over the years when organizations have been claiming to be hiring and saying that they have been doing equitable work and they've been trying to be equitable to employees. And in the case of schools and universities, they've been claiming that they're addressing and satisfying the needs of racialized people. So what are we to conclude then if today we're seeing some of these advertisements for Black employees? Was employment equity programs not working? How is it that employment equity policies did not result in programs and practices that enabled a diverse workforce that is reflective or representative of a Canadian population? And in many cases, we know a number of these organizations that are today trying to improve on the number of Black and other racialized and Indigenous and other racialized people into the workplace. We know they have been getting employment equity awards for their employment equity programs and policies. So we have to wonder, what then must we make of these things? So I suggest that these are questions that we must grapple with. And of course, we have to answer if we're going to move towards employment equity programs that are effective and responsive. And one of my other questions that I'd add for us to think about is,
good, how are you?
One of the other questions I have, if employment equity programs have been in place, and if organizations have been getting awards for having employment equity programs, and they're advertising they're doing so, and if they say they have been doing so, well, who has been benefiting from the so-called employment equity programs that have existed? Of course, it is understandable to think of employment equity as an extension of the Canada's multicultural policy or the multicultural discourse. And the multiculturalism was introduced in 1971 and became an act in 1988. So we have to see how multiculturalism might have informed our employment equity program policies and practices. And I quote the multiculturalism policy. It says the Constitution of Canada recognizes the importance of preserving and enhancing the multicultural heritage of Canadians. The Government of Canada recognizes the diversity of Canadians as regard to race, national or ethnic origin, color, and religion as a fundamental characteristics of Canadian society, and is committed to a policy of multiculturalism designed to preserve and enhance the multicultural heritage of Canadians, while working to achieve the equality of all Canadians in the economic, social, cultural, and political life of Canada. But we know that when the policies was introduced, it was, as Prime Minister Trudeau said at the time, Pierre Elliott Trudeau said, it was introduced and within a bilingual framework, meaning that French and English are the recognized language of Canada, and the expectation was that through creative encounters and exchanges, the other ethnic group members, that is non-English and non-French people, would eventually understand their position in society and eventually become, quote unquote, integrated into the Canadian society. So that's the promise of multiculturalism. And Canada is known as this grand state of multiculturalism. And everyone looks to Canada to see how multiculturalism is operating. And so if we indeed multiculturalism has been operating, and employment equity is building on it, what might some of the factors, difficulties we might see coming out of multiculturalism? Professor Eve Hack writes about how language in the multicultural policy is mobilized in the process of multicultural nation building. She argues that that multicultural is accomplished by embedding a racial hierarchy by way of a contradiction in the use of culture through the proxy of language, thus foreclosing its openness even as racial differentiation is disallowed and the possibility of language as a universal community is declared. And the universal idea of language is it's that English and French and all others must fit into these. And one of the points that to be made here is that we cannot separate language from ethnicity, from expression of culture and so forth. So we can talk about how those also inform and might influence what we see. So what's important to think of multiculturalism discourse then is its silence on race and how culture is used as a stand-in for race. So there's a tendency to see racialized people or people who are not white as having a different culture, and therefore multiculturalism might be seen as accommodating their culture. But it's just mere culture we want to accommodate, or we want to accommodate the whole person. And that's what the things we must grapple with. So, and Canada has prided itself as being a society where race is not something that determines one place in the society, but it has always been the case. Because when we think of our immigration policies, our immigration policies was based on racialized, how and when we introduce people from different societies into Canadian society. So when we look at the group of South Asians who came and were not allowed to land off Vancouver Harbor, when we look at bringing the Chinese men largely to work on railroads, when we talk of bringing Black in as domestics, those are not accidents. They were deliberate. And if you look at the immigration policies, you can see how these were very much part of those. How Canada expected to build itself. But more importantly, we have to look at how Canada was settled, and when Europeans came, how they expected that this newfound land, quote unquote newfound land, which indigenous people refer to and known as Turtle Island, was for them to possess, and in their possession determined who would come and not come into the Canadian society. So we have to grapple with that whole process of decolonization, and hence my reason for introducing that term, because if we're going to move equity, we're going to have to see how that background of Canada, how the indigenous people have been positioned in the Canadian society from the time of colonization to today. Indigenous people's relation to the land, we have to pay attention to all that and look at how, if equity is going to be achieved, then those are things we're going to have to grapple with, and also think about what we don't know or what we don't understand, and what we must learn about and understand if we're going to really move towards an equitable society. So as I said then, I introduced that to into the talk. So I'm asking us then to pay attention to that colonial past. And if we're talking of decolonization, we have to understand the fullness of that, of the meaning of decolonization, and how we're all implicated in moving towards that. And of course, we have to think about how African peoples were brought and were enslaved. And the idea of enslavement was very much part of the Canadian society and not necessarily only the US, which is also interesting because there's a tendency for us to think of the Underground Railroad as Africans enslaved people leaving the US to come to Canada. But of course, we know of our own process here in the Canadian society. So it is telling that as the years pass and our historians unearth and bring to our attention many of the past activities in Canada, we're learning things. I was intrigued that on the weekend of January 15th, when high school students in Vancouver were celebrating what they referred to as Equity Day, Equity Time, and they were commemorating Martin Luther King's birthday, January 15th, while students in Nova Scotia, and Black students in particular, were celebrating Black Loyalists of 1792. A CBC article reads, and the headline said, Nova Scotia pays attention to Black loyalists who sailed to Sierra Leone in 1792. It says, on January 15th, 1792, 15 ships carrying 1,196 Black loyalists left Halifax for Sierra Leone. The article talked about in the dead of winter, these many people, 1,000, that's 230 years ago, left the Halifax to return to go to Sierra Leone. And so what intrigues me then is how students in Vancouver were not, and no mention of that, and therefore, and how students in Halifax were very engaged in that process. That means then there is a need for us today in the Canadian society to think about that history that we don't know and we have to work on. So I referenced the stories between those because I'm thinking of these two coasts and how that one history that we don't know, and of course you might have heard some of this, because I always think that is not only Black History Month should alert us to those things, but we should know about these things, as when we think of, if we're moving towards equity, we would have to think of how that history has informed the kinds of situation that people are experiencing, and so we cannot leave that aside. So let me return to the point of how race tends to be dealt with in Canada, and that was one example. In the historical accounts is one example. Another way in how we use the word visible minority, and I'm always intrigued with the term visible minority. And of course, you know that the United Nations has asked that we rethink and remove that term. And when we do that, we do not get, if we continue to see visible minority as representing, and in the employment equity program, notice it says it says members of visible minority. It doesn't disaggregate that. An organization must disaggregate visible minority, quote unquote, I use the word racialized people. Organization must disaggregate that if it's going to get at equity. How can you just simply say, yes, we have good representation, and not pay attention to that, how that representation might not have been paid attention to. So visible minority then has resulted in some groups being underrepresented because of lumping, because the unease with using this. So in underrepresentation that has come about is, in many cases, Black or African members of a society tend to be underrepresented. Again, is because of the aggregate that we keep using. So in the spring and summer of 2020, we've seen efforts to scale up their whole presence and representation of Black or African Canadians. So it's not necessarily to push the idea of race and racism, but it's to understand that race also, just like gender, disability, and other factors inform people's lives. It's also a way of suggesting that, yes, race is one of those factors that employ people's lives, and it's a social construct. Again, I always think of how we think of race in very interesting ways. I don't know if you paid attention to Whoopi Goldberg and that issue when she found that she understood race in a particular way, like how race is understood in 21st century or today. And race before now was understood quite differently. So as you notice, you might know that that the books, how the Irish became white, how the Jews became white, etc., etc. So race was understood not necessarily strictly based on what today we assign to it as color, but it was introduced and used and thought of in terms of particular kinds of difference in relation to certain kinds of people. So race, then, we must see, is a social construct, and it changes, and it's very contextual. So for me, I always think of, when we think of brown, how brown people are understood in the US, and you know, we'd think of Latinx or Latin people might be brown people in the US, but also so is South Asians, and they come from different places. So when we also think of England, when in England we'd say Black people, and if you look at how England construct Black would also be Africans and people of South Asian background. So it's contextual. So hence we must pay attention to how it's used, think about the context in which we're using it, and relate to that. And given individuals' tendency to want to claim that they're colorblind, then they do this in order to avoid being seen as racist or seen as racism operated. That's race and racism tend to be overlooked in the workplaces. And that contributes to instances of social exclusion and oppression that touches the lives of minoritized people. So if we constantly use this colorblind lens, therefore, we're going to continue to reproduce underrepresentation of people. I recall Preston and Calwant of England saying, when speaking about race in education, many of us have been faced with the question, what about? And what about class? What about gender? What about sexuality? What about disability? What about faith? Whereas really, as speakers on these topics, if ever asked, what about race? A focus on race in analysis is indicative for some as a sign of pathology or suspicion. The point is, race must be named and addressed if we're ever going to move towards equity and inclusion. So what is equity then? I usually spend time defining the term equity because it's usually have a very, there's so much confusion about it. And I always like to differentiate equity from equality. And I know the legal term is also, equality is the legal term, with substantive equality and what's the other one? Other equality, so which is different. So equity here, then, I will define equity means given opportunities and conditions provided to individuals that are responsive to their needs, interests, and aspirations. So equity must pay attention to what the individual needs are and constructing opportunities in relation to these individual needs and interests. It also means treating students or individuals them equally so that they have the same or similar outcomes. So you're going to have to treat people differently if they're going to have the same or similar outcome. It gauges the results of action directly against the standards of justice. So for equity to be realized, then we must pay attention to justice. Hence, my introduction in the title of justice, the importance of justice, and what is seen as a just approach to things and a just approach to people, taking into account who they are and the situations and the context in which they live. So the fair treatment then of people, and the fair treatment would make providing access, providing opportunities, and understanding how people are positioned in society, because this positioning in society informs the possibilities that they would have in terms of their eventual outcome. If we're moving towards equity as well, the other point that I think is we have to identify the barriers that are obstacles or prevent people's effective participation in society. And in doing so, I'm arguing that we have to work to prevent these barriers, to remove these barriers, to seek to make sure that people are able to be successful as they go on. The most important thing I wanted to suggest then is equity is a process. It cannot be seen as we're doing equity today and then it's gone. And we bring racialized people into the workplace and therefore that's it, it's done, we now have representation. Cannot be, inequity is what exists, that's why, and unless that structure of inequity is addressed, then we're always going to have to be working against that inequitable structure to make the process of equity a reality. So equity is not achieved by treating everyone the same. Rather, it can only be achieved by treating everyone or all groups of people differently in relation to their content, to their circumstances. Equality, on the other hand, means treating people the same. It does benefit all individuals, since the treating of people the same would not produce the outcome. I always remember at one time I did an essay while I was going to university, and I did an essay, and I approached the professor and said, I did it early, and I approached the professor and asked, could you read my paper before I hand it to you officially? And then the professor said, no, because she wasn't doing that for everyone. Therefore, I needed to be treated the same as everyone, despite the effort that was done. And that professor was thinking of what she was doing as fair, and fair to everyone. But to be fair means sometimes you're going to have to treat people differently. So equality conceived of making it possible for all students, regardless of backgrounds, to attend school. You give them the same test, the same, and all these same might not really produce the outcome. And if we look at what the representation is then today, we can see how these things have produced, because we've been treating everyone the same, because we think of the fairness as the same, that have produced the situation that we find ourselves in. Working at equity then means that we must acquaint ourselves with our own attitudes, our biases, our values, and how they inform the perceptions we have and the interactions we have with others. And also how the institution, we have to acquaint ourselves with the institutional policies and programs, and how those institutional policies and programs might be operated. I'm always intrigued that we always, in 2021, 2022, we're trying to institute institutional policies. We use policies that were developed in 2020 or 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We use those policies today to make sure that we're doing things the same. But how could the 2022 policies, how could we use these policies today when we're dealing with a different context, different group of situation? And I keep wondering right now, how when we think of post-COVID, and we try to use pre-COVID measures for post-COVID educational situation, post-COVID, is it going to be fair, workable? And so those are some of the things I want us to think about as we move towards moving equity. And I'm saying all this to say that if we're going to be allies, we have to acquaint ourselves with all these discourses and all these issues, And sometimes they're going to be difficult for us to grapple with because we're so invested, or because the work we do, the work expect us to be invested in making these things what they are. So I want us to discuss. And I also want us to think of equity and inclusion and all those things on different levels. It's not just individual things that we're talking about. Ever so often, I kept talking about inclusion, and so. But I'm thinking it's happening at the individual level, the institutional level, and the communities and society. And I think here, even though individuals might mean well, because we are working in institutions that have certain policies that we are forced to introduce or implement, we are caught in doing so, and hence it might not be that easy to do. And so it's when we're thinking of these things, we have to think of the individual level, the institutional level, and the communities with which we are connected, and also at the society level, and how all these things operate. So how to implement equity in the workplace then? Equity in the workplace means, as some would say, leveling the playing field and giving every employee the unique resources they need to have access to opportunities within that organization. One of the things I'm looking at some literature around that talked about how do we implement equity, and one way is one article talked about we have to prioritize wage equity is one of the ways we must do so. And discussion of wage, and sometimes because we don't like the discussing wage or money, we tend not to do so. It tends to be a taboo. But wage sometimes are signals of disparities, and so sometimes we're going to have to talk deliberately about wages and be transparent about wages if we're going to really be open and move towards the equitable situation, because wage signals the differences and the difficulties. And there, I'm quoting this article that says, many organizations hire for equity, but fail to provide equitable opportunities for advancement for their racialized hires. When this happens, what we see is high diversity in low paying or low authority jobs, and over representation of one demographic in the leadership of the organization. This suggests that organizations need to empower racialized employees by giving equitable promotions and upholding diverse representation even at the executive level. And this is what is so common today, is the representation at the executive levels that we're not seeing. So we just can't be saying, okay, let's hire and hire only for these low positions, because that signals something for us as well. It signals that, yes, we can hire you and you are only good and we are for these entry-level positions, but the authority positions are reserved for other kinds of people. So we have to start doing work in that area. And the work that we must do then must also be an educational work. We need to also educate our employees and educate our communities and educate the Canadian society about what we mean and how we're moving towards equity. So I come now to the point of having discussed equity that we talked about. So how are we going to put it into force? Not necessarily having racialized people, women, people with disability, indigenous people, being the only ones to put it forward or push the agenda of equity or push the agenda of representation and justice and decolonization. There needs to be, and there must be, allies in order to get there. So the idea, what is an ally? And what does it mean to be an ally? And who who are positioned as ally or who position themselves as ally, and how do we get there? And again, the point is we cannot get to equity without these allyship, without this being necessarily part of the discussion. In one article, allyship is defined as when a person of privilege works in solidarity and partnership with a marginalized group of people to help take down the systems that challenge the group's basic rights, equal access, and ability to thrive in our society. That was Nicole Hara saying that. And she continued to say, allies must also have some degree of power to effect change. An example she gave, an example I used to use when explaining allyship is the occurrence of mansplaining. Is the word, and I'm quite sure you're familiar with the word mansplaining. In a work environment, mansplaining is a man interrupts a speaking woman explaining the topic from his perspective as if his thoughts are more important than hers. An ally most likely, another man would step in to stop the mansplaining from happening and allow the woman to finish speaking. And then another article talked about allies must help in paving the way for new investigation and for new ways of doing things. And the allies must be willing to share lessons learned and to learn lessons. And allies must be willing and able to work towards developing trust, because only trust that and having trust with each other will be able to bring about the kinds of collaborative work and partnership that's essential for the work that must be done. And so that's all going to be essential for this alliance. So sincerity and authenticity, Howard says, is wanting to work towards a common goal of reducing the disparities that might exist. Allyship can be a small action. And so she says that it doesn't have to be a big act, but very small action. Mentorship is one of those ways, also taking voice, but also not having to, also having the marginalized persons or the marginalized colleague constantly having to be placed in the position of having to explain themselves. In a Harvard article I read, Harvard Business Review, it talked about be a better ally. And they argued, they put forward some other major points that I want to quickly go through, and then I can come to a conclusion, hopefully in the next few minutes, where we can enter into discussion. I don't see any questions in the chat, but remember, I'm still here for questions. So in that Harvard review, Be a Better Ally, by Bonkura, Beeman, and Johnson, they wrote, for too long, leaders from majority groups have helped preserve the status quo, which favors them, by relegating diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to human resources instead of using their own power to effect change. Research shows that many white male leaders deny racism or avoid discussing it because these conversations feel uncomfortable or controversial. They fail to acknowledge their own privilege, insisting that their organization are gender and colorblind. Very few understand the problems that steps they can take to be effective allies with marginalized groups. And they talk about allyship as being a strategic mechanism used by individuals to become collaborators, accomplices, and co-conspirators who fight injustice and promote equity in the workplace through supportive personal relationship and public acts of sponsorship and advocacy. What's important here, I would underscore the word sponsorship and advocacy. And so it's not necessarily, and sponsorship means being deliberate in moving and helping and putting forward people. And sponsorship, and there was an article I read some time ago that talked about we don't want any more mentors, we want sponsors. And I don't think it's an either or really, but what the article is saying, you can be a mentor, but never sponsor anyone. So sponsorship means introducing persons and advocating on their behalf and helping to move the agenda. So I'm going to go through some of the main points that they brought forward as important points that we need to, that would help and enable to become good allies. One of it is educate yourself. And they said, do your homework. It can be tempting to ask women, race, people of color, and women of color about their experiences with inequity and injustice. But that unfairly burdens them with the emotional and cognitive labor an ally, while an ally could do that work. So it's important here. You know, I'm always intrigued recently that we're always looking for people with lived experience. And if you ever notice, who are the people who we usually think of having the lived experience that they bring into an organization and bring into the conversation? It's as if a white majority person doesn't have lived experience that they bring into that conversation. They have lived experience. So we just can't reserve lived experience to certain kinds of people. And so we have to make everybody know how their lived experience is constantly informing how they see how they see things and how they're interpreting things and how they're moving on things. So it's important then for us to pay attention to how lived experience and our lived experience, everyone lived experience is informing perceptions, behaviors, practices, and attitudes, and not relegate lived experience to those people who are racialized only. I remember doing research recently, maybe about a year or two ago, and this research was about the use of the word in To Kill a Mockingbird, the N word in To Kill a Mockingbird in the school board, and I wasn't asked to do anything about it, but doing the research and interviewing Black students in the school, they raised the issue of the N-word in school and what it meant and how it was used. And I talked about the fact that To Kill a Mockingbird was a book used in the school. It also legitimized the word, and therefore we have to see how are we going to use it. And so I wrote that in the research, that report that I sent in. And the people to whom I gave the report questioned my going there and raising this in the report, because that wasn't what the report was supposed to. I was supposed to interview Black kids, talk about their experience, and that came up. But they said to me, no, it was my lived experience that I'm bringing into the report, and that was not the value and usefulness of what I'm supposed to do. So had somebody else done that, would their lived experience not be considered? And so that's thrown out for consideration. But here's how we see some as having lived experience that inform their research, and others are seen as neutral or not bringing a bias to their discussion. And we must see how we use these lenses to interpret practices and behavior. And one of the things they also talked about when we talk of educate is it's how in many of these places, sometimes women, indigenous people might be the only one in the room. And sometimes, ever so often, I always remember doing research and hearing students talk and students in classroom, and when the issue of say race comes up or Black, so the one Black student in the class, everybody looks at him, her, or them to talk to the issue, and they're as if everybody should, and that's the only time that they might be invited to talk. So we have to be conscious about how we must, as allies, we have to step in to challenge some of those ways in which we just simply automatically or react to things and make these things what they are. one of the other points that this article make is own your privilege. Don't deny that privilege, because in knowing that privilege and owning it, it's recognized. They say being an ally requires recognizing the advantages, opportunities, resources, and power that one has based on whiteness or gender or something like that, and how others are denied those privileges or those advantages because of their location or because of their identities. This can be painful because it's for people owning their privilege, they're saying. It can be painful because it often means admitting that you haven't entirely earned your success. But it's necessary. It's also important to understand that privilege is a resource that can be deployed for a good of the organization. Another point they made was accept feedback. And there's a tendency to seek feedback from marginalized groups, but do not like the idea of when the feedback is uneasy and makes one feel uneasy, because that feedback must also be accepted, because you ask for feedback, and that's what's important. And the Teasdale uses the term, when people react to your feedback, to the racialized person or the woman, the person with disability, or the indigenous person, when people react to them and they experience certain kinds of certain kinds of stress, they call that the inclusion tax. So if you're going to be included, there's that, and of course you might have heard about race tax as well. So the inclusion tax. And I'm going to quickly go through the others because I want us to have a conversation, because I've been talking too long. Some of the other points are become a confidant, to be able to be available, to listen, to be generous in your listening, and to try to empathize with and validate the experiences of people. And the other important point is bring diversity to the table. That is, always be willing to think about who is not in the room, why, and to think about why are these people the only people in the room. And so, because that's important, because sometimes when racialized or marginalized people are the only ones in the room, it can spur outsider syndrome or the imposter syndrome. And we can talk about imposter syndrome. The other one is see something and say something. And the idea of seeing something and saying something is important, because sometimes in not saying something means that you're not giving attention, and it might not be given voice and enabling the voice of others. And insist on diverse representation in all these contexts. Because if people talk from their experience, therefore, if some people are not around the table to talk through that experience or with that experience, then we don't see that's happening. Too often, what I'm seeing these days with moving towards diversity and equity and inclusion, management continue to be not diverse, and when you push the diversity, it's people send their information to the team and no one there at the table to have those discussions. That's not going anywhere. And they also observe that what we see is a lot of communications, a lot of public relations, where we see all these reports out on their websites, et cetera, and communications people hired to say how well the organizations are doing with regard to diversity, when things are not really happening on the ground in order to change what's been the case. So allyship then is for allies need to be able to point out these things and call out these things and change the the tenor of how things are in these organizations if we're going to move and get equity. So are we ready to do this? I'm not sure, because again, I think it's a process, and it's going to cost us. It's going to cost us individually. It's going to cost organization. And I don't think that cost is a bad cost. I think the cost is to the benefit of the entire organization, to individuals, and to the benefit of the society and the Canadian society generally. Because in moving towards a more equitable society, we're moving towards a society that's going to be more sustainable. And that's the reality. And sustainable being the economics that can benefit, that people can benefit economically. Because if we're going to not have people graduating from school being able to read, therefore that's cost. And everybody's going to have to bear that cost. So if we can see how the cost that we bear in order to become an ally and for the organization, then we'll take every one of us are certainly going to be benefit in significant ways. Okay, I think I should stop now since I've been going on for quite a while. And thanks very much, Kyle. So I'm open to question, and I'm open to a real big challenging discussion and challenge some of the points I made, because these were deliberate and provocative. Yes, Jessica.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really informative. I just wanted to circle back. You were talking about, how when we ask questions about race in a classroom, often that individual who is diverse themselves are often the person looked to answer that question. And while I agree, I think for me, the way I always thought about that was, it's not my lived experience, and I should be using my platform and my privilege to elevate voices that are diverse and have that experience. And what are some of your recommendations for sort of walking that line between wanting to elevate diverse voices, but also not wanting the expectation to be on people who are diverse to have to speak up and have to take on that position?
Excellent point. And that's excellent. Here we're caught. On one hand, I'm like I just said, you don't look to the person because you're now giving them voice, you're now giving them a platform, and at the same time I'm saying you just can't do that. Here's a problem. What that signals to me is, how much have I created in my classroom, or have I created in my relationship with these people, the idea that they have voice and they can say things beyond just simply talking about themselves or talking about their lived experience. So it's a reflection of the fact that the context in which they have been associating, the relationships that they might have had, and or the society in which we live, they've gotten the message that you're only going to be heard when I want to hear about your lived experience. And therefore, it's only on those occasions. So I think if we're going to move towards equity and move towards realizing and moving towards that diverse grouping, and to the point that you make, which is quite appropriate, we have to say, have I created the kind of space here where all these voices are going to be believing, I'm not just going to listen to them or hear them when I need to hear about their pain or their situation or their lived experience, but I'm hearing from them at other times with other things that they're presenting to us. And probably it's for both of us, both the marginalized and the non-marginalized person, to work through that. And it might mean, yes, it might also mean sometimes, Jessica, introducing the person and asking the person, but paying attention to saying, yeah, I know, I'm not only asking you because of I want to hear from you because now it relates to your direct experience, etc. And you're now open to say it. You have to claim that understanding. You have to demonstrate that you understand that the privilege that others have had, that this person has not had, and therefore the space is not just simply relegated for that purpose. So it's that work that must be done at that time, and it's recognizing that that person is, you know, the more we can identify how we understand the experience we're calling these people to explain, the more we can identify that we understand that lived experience that person might have without them telling us. The more we can demonstrate that there is an appreciation that, yes, you know what you're doing here, and there's an honesty, and therefore that relationship and that collegial understanding can bear fruit into making the life situation the way that we'd want it. I don't know if I fully answered that, but do you have a follow-up, or is that okay?
No, I think that, I mean, that's a good point. There definitely needs to be more spaces made for safe conversations and open dialogue, and not strictly just in the context of a classroom or when we're willing to hear it. I just think it starts to become very easy to use your voice and not recognize that you are speaking over other voices rather than
Yes.
elevating diverse
Yeah.
voices.
Yeah.
Which I think is a fine line we have to try and walk, because we
Yeah.
want to, you know, bulldoze and open the space for those voices to speak without speaking for them at the same time.
I agree. And demonstrate that we know what the person is living with. And in that demonstration, they will appreciate that understanding that we know what they're living with. And it's not that we're trying to push them into that corner as they've always had. We're knowing this time, I know, but I'm not just making it just because you're who you are at this time. And that demonstration is useful. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes? Brenda?
You're muted.
You're
muted.
Sorry. I am going back to that last question and your answer. It is part of, I'm wondering if part of what you're talking about is in building relationship in the classroom. I've always been a believer of creating classroom community. To some extent, that involves, it has for me in the past, and so I'm asking you, it involves sort of deconstructing white a little bit, because we tend to go into those classrooms sometimes, I think, and as you mentioned before, we want to hear about people whose culture are different than, say, my white culture. We want to hear about their lived experience, and the white kids get to feel normal, and the racialized students get to feel cultural, or you know what I mean. So sometimes I think going into the classroom, it's important to deconstruct some of that white too, and holding the whitest students accountable for culture and understanding their particular culture.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, I always think about how much when we use the say the acknowledgement of the land acknowledgement in context, we say it, but do we really think about the culture in which we are imposing this land acknowledgement, or are we really understanding in this context of it's signaling for us the colonization that has taken place? Yeah. And so it's like the land acknowledgement, then it's done, then we move on to the European white culture that we continue to live with, rather than thinking and using that land acknowledgement to infuse the kind of, no, I have to talk differently because, you know, I've just acknowledged that Indigenous people have a particular position in our society. And I'm wondering, am I carrying through on that beyond just simply having said the land acknowledgement? Absolutely. That's what I always think about when I'm in these contexts. And what you just said reminds me of that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, how do we fit how does a white person make the land acknowledgement, and be able to kind of personalize that? Like, what is that, rather than just voicing it? I don't, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Holly.
Actually, I was just going to begin by echoing really what Brenda had said. I was thinking that, yes, a part of the way through is just ensuring that we all are speaking from a place of lived experience, and that we recognize our own racialization and how we ourselves have been shaped by a cultural context. And it kind of ties back also into the notion of Indigenous worldview, because really an Indigenous worldview is very much understanding oneself in relationship with all other living beings, people, animals, plants, all of that. So it's understanding oneself as a part of the whole, as opposed to artificially dividing object from subject. And I think that really taking that to heart, that way of seeing in terms of not putting yourself in a subject position, can be a really helpful way to sort of put yourself into a circle that is a true circle, where there's no one ahead and there is no one behind, right? So anyways, that was just what I was thinking. I really had appreciated that when you said we all have lived experience. That resonated with me.
And the other point that you remind me of is that good Indigenous word that term that constantly comes back to me is always, we're all in relation. You know, it's, if we just see the ideas and what goes on is just simply us, then we're missing an important part of really impacting the larger world, and how the larger world in which we live are really impacting us, and we're impacting. So if we constantly think of ourselves as always in relation, and not just in relation based on our particular communities, but in all the communities that we traverse, then that makes some commitment to moving forward. Thanks very much, Holly, for that reminder. Myrna.
Yeah, thank you so much for this great presentation. I have a question. You mentioned visible minority, and this term always has puzzled me, because I think the term itself is racist. So who exactly is included in visible minority? How can we define it?
Everyone who's not white. But then you can ask the question, so who's white? And then who are the people not white? The whole thing is, as a person who constantly look at sociology, I'm always intrigued about how the racial groups that we have identified, and how do some people fit, and how do some people not fit. However, the word visible minority is very nicely employed, and it's used very much in terms of who is in the population and who are not in the population. The fact is, I choose to pay attention to how do we racialize people is one of my words. And therefore, how that racialization is understanding, or it's operating in the lives of the people that we're talking about. And so the visible minority would refer to those people who are not white, are constructed as white in our society, and therefore the attempt of the employment equity program, because that term came in during the employment equity program at that time, in order to be able to, quote unquote, attempt to work towards making everyone have access to opportunities. That's where the visible minority. And notice Canada is the only place that such term exists. Others have other terms. But interestingly enough, I don't know your reaction to the word BIPOC, But there again, and then people of color. Those terms keep coming up over and over again. It shows you, from my perspective, our relationship to race, the difficulties of our relationship to race, and this attempt at all times to try to lump or homogenize or something. So, you know, I was hearing somebody say something recently, BIPOC. You know, there's Black, Indigenous, people of color, and Black people, people of color as well. So wouldn't that be a superfluous term then? And so, you know, all these things are difficulties.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, to me, it's like we're putting people in two different categories, right? And that's racist, right? So I'm not sure. It's like, but you mentioned that the United Nations is working on getting rid of this term. So hopefully that happens.
Oh, no, no. You know how long that was raised in the United Nations? About 10 or more years ago. And if you look on the web, you'll see it. And that representation was made to the Canadian government that many years ago, asking that the term be removed, stop. But we still have it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very convenient, though. Thanks. Tammy.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a question around being an ally and a sponsor, because I find out that quite a number of people who would say people of color actually balk at the idea of diversity and inclusion, because I've heard people say it's almost like reverse, how do I call it? Is it reverse colonization? So I wanted to know what your thoughts are about that. In fact, I had a conversation with someone over the weekend, and she said, well, I don't really like my organization's policies about diversity and inclusion. I just feel it's lip service, and I feel like they are just putting, and she's white, by the way, it's like they're colonizing those people all over again. So I'd like to know your thoughts about that.
You know, thanks for the question. I agree, and we are going to have problems with it, with the whole idea of really putting forward the work that needs to be done in order to increase the racialized people and what happens. But if, again, if we're doing it without paying attention and acknowledging that racism operated in the organization, then, and continue to operate in the organization, therefore and don't do anything about it, these changes are only window dressing. So yes, there's something to do. And also, I don't think it's far-fetched what the person suggested. It's another way of saying, see, we are addressing it, but the organization remains the same. The leadership remains the same. The kinds of policies on which the organization is built remain the same, and not really move to accommodate the diversity that we're trying to promote. So on one hand, we want the change to take place. We want the change to happen. On the other hand, if people are going to take steps towards getting there, and the people who are responsible for taking the steps and enabling that need to engage in an education to get there. And it's not going to happen overnight. I'm not sure how long this era of change and equity is going to continue. I was interviewing a young Black man, grade 12 student, earlier, I think it was last September. Oh, no, I think it was November, we were having a conversation. And he raised the same question about how things are going to change. And he and I had a discussion because he was thinking, he's going to university, he's thinking of how COVID has impacted his life. And he's thinking that there are good times that happening, and he wants to take advantage of that. And he asked, so his question was, how long do you think this is going to last? and he says, and so I asked him, so how long do you think the changes that we're asking for? He says, probably another 4 years, he says. And then we had further conversation about the 1970s, the 1980s, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the conversation, he says to me, oh, it's going to only last a year. So this is not going to go on much longer. And this guy is 17 years old. So what's significant for us then is yes, that's what he's thinking, but we have to, as everyone, and we're talking about allyship today, we have to take what he's thinking of into account and help move the organization. And we have to go back and start looking at what we have in place right now. Are they reasonable things to maintain, or should we be changing things? I think that's an important question for us to ask. Do you have a follow-up, Temi, before I come to Janice?
No, I think you answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Janice.
Well, before you get to Janice, there's a comment in the chat from Patricia. And she says, many critical scholars would say the term visible minority is outdated, and the term racialized is a more suitable term, as it speaks to the complexities of people's experiences. That's from Patricia Duhaney.
Yes, and the use of the word racialized, and another word that's used, and very common sociology word, is racial minority is another word. But as you notice, why people like racialized is because it can be a verb, or it can be seen as a verb. In other words, that people are being racialized, rather than just simply saying that these people are just, visible minority. It's a noun, you're there. But racialized would signal that this is not people choosing to be that, but it's because of the way society constructs them, or work with them, or thinks through them. The same thing can be said of minoritized people, and minoritized could be women, people with disability, all those kind, racialized people, all are minoritized. So increasingly, the English language is being rewritten, or the meaning of words are being rewritten in order to give us the kind of work that we need to do. Janice.
Thanks. I've really enjoyed. I'm only sorry that I wasn't able to join right at 12 o'clock. I had computer problems, but I've really enjoyed the last half hour and this discussion. So thank you. I'm just wondering if you believe that there's a correlation between this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the whole Canadian experience of assimilation versus integration, because and I'm thinking of this in regards to the dialogues that we have, right? And anyway, because in Canada, I think we still have a very strong colonial attitude that the European Caucasian way of thinking is the correct or the normal one, and we want others to assimilate to our Canadian way of thinking, instead of us integrating other worldviews and accepting them as being of equal value. So wouldn't it help also to focus some of our dialogues on our colonial understanding of what integration really means?
Yeah.
Okay.
I totally agree. And integrate into what is the other part to the question of integration. And when we think of integration, yeah, people are not being integrated into a vacuum, into a neutral space. You're integrating into a space with a particular culture. And that's why I always think, when I think of culture, I never use the word culture, race, ethnicity, etc., because culture is all consuming. Culture is that overarching activity that informs our behavior, ideas, and practices, etc. So when I think that we're moving towards integration, into what, and what are the values, ideas of the society that people are asked to integrate into, and integrate into the community as well, what the values, ideas, and the same thing with organization. Again, these are not neutral spaces. These are spaces with a particular set of values, because to be able to have been able to operate, we have had to establish these things. I also tell students, when I go into a classroom, we create a culture in that classroom, and because of who is there. And anyone who comes into that classroom is coming, who's not accustomed to that classroom, who comes into a classroom where they will see the culture. And sometimes we don't even see the culture because we're so much part of it and we take it for granted. And when somebody comes in and finds it strange and different, and having to adapt to that culture, something that is difficult for them, we who have been so immersed in it cannot see that culture. I always reference a passage by Berlin. If fishes were able to investigate the medium of their communication of their lives, or if birds were supposed to do the same kind of investigation, both of them would not look at, the fish would not think of water, neither the bird look at the air, because they take that for granted. Similarly, us in a Canadian context, we take things for granted because it's so much a part of us. So therefore, the learning that we have to do is always think of how we are so much a part of the culture that we're perpetuating, and think of how that culture gets formed. You know, I think of an immigrant who have lived here for 10, 20, 30, 40 years and go back to the country of origin. And everybody will say, and if they go back, and they will always think that they're going back to their home country and think they have the values, ideas, and practices of the home country, even after 10 years, or even after 5. And somebody will say, where you from? And then you're believing that you're so much from there. Because what happens then is you have so much internalized and adapted to the culture in which you are, that it becomes so much part of you. And so that's some of the work that outsiders have to do to be able to relate. And so insiders always think that they do not have to do that work because the privilege and so forth and enable that to live. So yes, there is that how we understand integration is to understand integration into what, and how much people change the culture when they come in, and how much we resist changing that culture as much as possible because we don't want to see the culture in which we have grown up strange to us. So we resist it. And so we, no matter what, anyone coming to this society, some change is going to happen. And that change is even going to happen, even to the change, to resist them, it means is to change the culture. So change in the culture. Yes, you're going to add something, Joyce.
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking more in terms like that integration instead of assimilation is, I see as assimilation into something. But in my mind, integration is more about a dynamic process of constant change. And there's one aspect of the Canadian culture that doesn't want to change, just like what you're saying, it's difficult. But it's only one part of them. Yes, all of I see the immigrants and everybody who's coming into the country, they change. And like you say, I know going back home or to their country of origin, they think that they're still the same, but they're not. And I see that happening, right? But it's the people here who don't change, right? And they're not doing any integrating by involving themselves with other communities and learning what are all of the positive aspects that they can absorb from everybody who's here. That's what,
But I invite you to think about it this way. Yes, they don't want to change, but you know, they change. Because to resist the new people, they have to have changed the behavior in order to resist them. Because remember, those people never were there in the first place. So you develop particular kinds of skills, ideas, and even think about in a particular way in order to resist them. And so therefore, they have an impact on the system and the society and to your behavior. And so, but I also think most societies would, and Canada is one, would think that we do not assimilate. But I think assimilation happens, especially if the group that's there, the power group, et cetera, and if you're going to get anywhere, there's some level of assimilation that's going to take place in order to be able to communicate effectively. Integration, yes, I understand that, but it's a process. But even in that process of integrating, you're going to adopt certain ideas, et cetera. So, for example, I don't know if you looked at in Ottawa when all the truckers were there. Then people will, when people would reference, they would say they use the bodies of people to say how different Canadians, or even to show the diversity of people, to show that they even were able to have people who are not white present, and that in itself is therefore who is Canadian and who are non-Canadian. So we develop these kinds of ways of talking, and therefore, why aren't the racialized person will be asked where you're from. The white person very rarely are asked, especially if you're quote unquote have a quote unquote Canadian accent, as if Canada doesn't have accent as well. So all these things, I think, are part and parcel of that whole integration assimilation process, and we use these things in order to construct people as different, and construct people as belonging, and construct what we can expect of them, and construct what the expectations are. I was listening recently to the news, and there was, and I think it was a bank that was trying to do some hires of Indigenous people, and they wanted the people to talk about, have photos of the regalia kind of thing, as if to suggest, no, we want to see that you're quote unquote authentic, and therefore that's going to be used. Those kinds of, and I see those as assimilation and integration strategies that in ways in which organizations operate. But you have something to add, do you?
Okay. Great, thank you so much.
Carl,
Thank
there's
you.
a question from Jerry. She says, Jerry Shepherd. She says, I have a question about how to facilitate conversations about how race and allies are portrayed in literature and the media.
I like that question. I like the question, especially in media. I always say that, the media play a significant role in helping to change the discourses we have in our society, and also in representing different people who are part of the society, and making us feel that they're part of us. So we cannot have this conversation, and we cannot talk about change unless the media also make it possible to represent Canada and Canadians in all its diversity, and represent them as Canadians. So allyship then would require us to also push the media and push the literature that we read to into ways in which we see all these as Canadian. And I think of the literature here, and I referenced earlier about the students in Vancouver celebrating Martin Luther King, and the student in Halifax talking about the Africans who were going to Sierra Leone. And what we could have said is how many of those Africans who were leaving Nova Scotia had come from Jamaica in the first place as Maroons, and therefore were going back to, going to Sierra Leone. Now, we have to think of how in the absence of some of the historical information that the history books that might not have been written to tell us all this fulsome story. And we should think of our history books as giving us over only half of the truth of Canadian life and Canadian story. So unless the literature provide that, then until then, the media will have to give us and provide that in today's tone. But until all that happens, then we're going to work. So allies then and their partners will have to make representation, not only in organization, but in the communities in which we operate. And probably ally could write to the Toronto, to write to the various newspapers or to the various media to ask about the representation. And I always think, that we should have a nicely revised historical main history of Canada that starts with Indigenous people, because if the history that we have doesn't start with Indigenous presence, then that history is incomplete and not very, very talking about the reality of the land space we live on.
Well, I appreciate what you said about context too. And so as you look at the literature and the media, you also have to think about who's provided this information. Historically, geographically, and I'm American, but I've done some teaching in Canada, but I think this is the question for everybody everywhere, is how do we then take what we get in the media or look at people who come from other countries, I'll say to the United States. What do they think? They think that everybody in the United States has a gun, or that it's violent everywhere, or whatever. Little pieces of information that they get from TV shows, the media, this type of thing. And so I guess the question is, how do we then facilitate conversations about these things? Bridgerton is a great example. I don't know if you know of that on Netflix, but that they're just coming out with the second season of it. But it's a historical fiction, of course. And well, I don't know if it's historical really, but it takes place, and the queen is a woman of color, and the main character is a man of color. And so they're in royalty in England in, I don't know, 17 something, I can't remember when it was. But it's very interesting to see that portrayed in a place where that probably never would have happened.
Yes. I like the reference to America and the US is one of the things, because remember in our construction of Canada is that we're different from the US. So race doesn't have the same meaning and same terrible things in Canada and the US. After all, remember African Americans, formerly enslaved Americans, left the US and came to Canada through the Underground Railroad. What our history books never tell us is how many of them returned to the US afterwards, after emancipation, because they did not find Canada any different from the US. And so it reminds me of, I think earlier last year, I was invited to give a talk to a group of university students in Chicago, and one Black student, and the talk was about racial profile and Black police relations in Canada. And she came to the talk because she thought, what could he ever be talking about Black police relations? Because as far as she's concerned, Black police relations in Canada was so much better than what was going on in the States. And so she said to me, well, after my conversation talking about the number of police deaths in terms of Indigenous people, Black people, the racial profiling issue, she was in awe. She was saying, you're not telling me the truth, because that's not our impression of the Canadian society. It was quite different. So yes, media play a good role in maintaining that image of our Canadian society.
Thank you.
There's a comment in the chat from Jessica May. She says the Wortley report, WORTLEY, is extremely telling in that regard.
Yes, the Wortley report talks about police relations with the Black community and communities in general. There's another report that just came out this week, as some colleagues sent it to me, that were talking about, it was talking about the number of incidents of reported hate crimes in the Canadian society. And it showed how significant number of hate crimes reports were from Black people, and when it came to religion, it was Jewish people and Muslim, and how those were operating in the society, influencing the situation of both groups, all these groups. Yes, I can tell you. I can tell you. I can send to you the report. Butter asked about the report from that that I was referring to. I don't have it immediately, but I can always look for the report and send it to you.
Might it be available through the Canadian Race Relations Foundation?
Yes. I can tell you in one sec. That's a nice thing about being on
Online.
Oh, okay. So I can tell you in a while. Yeah, the title of the article is Statistics Canada Hate Crime Reports.
I think the Canadian Race Relations Foundation was having a
Police reported hate crimes in Canada 2020. It's written by Zhang Wang, W-A-N-G, and Greg Moreau, M-O-R-E-A-U. And it's from the Canadian Centre for Justice and Community Safety Statistics. Released March 17th, 2022. Police reported hate crimes in Canada 2020.
okay. Any other questions?
I would like to add something or say something. When you talk about assimilation and integration, I remember there were so many stories about Pakistani British who, when they are in Britain, they are told you're not British, and when they go back to Pakistan, they are told you're not Pakistanis, and they're like struggling. They're in the middle. They don't know really where they belong. So that's a great example. And I want to mention about the difference between the US and Canada. I am an American citizen, and I definitely, when we first moved to Canada, and we moved because of my husband's work, I found a big difference between here and US. And no one in the US asked me where I'm from, despite my accent. Well, whenever I meet a person for the first time here in Canada, the first question I am asked is like, where are you from? And it bothered me at the beginning. And I told my husband said, just tell them you live in Calgary, who cares? But I care, because it makes me feel like, I'm not a Canadian citizen yet, but it just makes me feel that I don't belong here. So I definitely realize there's a big difference between the US and here. That doesn't mean that in the US they don't ask such a question, but it never happened with me.
Yes. You know, remember we were talking about integration and assimilation earlier, where we were talking about how the society, when new people come in, we will always pretend that the culture doesn't change, but the culture changes. Because imagine if people like us and new people did not come in, that whole question where you're from might never be an everyday question, but it's so much an everyday question that people constantly want to position you where you're from. And also, somebody might use the term when you say where you're from, they might say, oh, they're trying to be friendly, or they're trying to work with you or befriend you. So that's why they ask you where you're from. So if somebody says they're trying to be a good friend, and that's why they ask you, so they use your difference to become your friend. How do you respond to that? And that they could say that that's a showing of how much they appreciate you because they're asking you about your difference.
I mean, they probably don't mean anything, right? Anything bad by asking such a question, but to me, it's kind of like, it bothered me because I had never, I mean, we lived in different places. We lived in Europe as well. And I never had such questions. So I am not sure why it's like when we first moved to Canada, the first question, it's always the first question, it's like, where are you from? And I just can't accept the question. I don't know why. But again, maybe they don't mean anything bad. Maybe they're trying to be friends, actually.
But you see, is there another way of being a friend without pointing out my difference? Is the important question. And so I would say yes, there is. But it's so much a reflection of how Canada constructs itself as certain kinds of accents with certain kinds of people and all those kind of things, and therefore use these things to position you. So another way in which these are used is to position you in the society. So the question is, do you belong? So if certain kinds of people are in certain spaces and you never see these kinds of people or hear that kind of accent in these spaces, they always say you're not from here, and that becomes one of the ways that's used to say that you don't belong here, therefore get out, or you're going to have to do some work to make us convinced that you really belong here. And many people will complain ever so often about how those spaces become so exclusionary and people use these where you're from as ways in which they how they're treated. But I like the idea of pushing back and ask them. And a number of people ask the person who asked that question, where are you from? And they always think, well, I'm from Canada naturally, so why are you asking? So therefore, pushing that back reminds them that the different accented Canadians.
I want to add, Carl, and I'm going to put Brenda on the spot and ask her to talk about this. We have no idea, well, Brenda and I have an idea. We have no idea how that question affects children, young people, and how they don't see themselves, young kids of color, how they don't see themselves as Canadians. And Brenda and I have one experience of working in a school where the kids of color didn't see themselves as Canadians. Second and third generation didn't see themselves as kids of color. Brenda?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'd been working with this group for a couple of years, doing a class with them. And it was very interesting asking them the question after all this time. It was a very diverse class. And I just can't remember the context, but I think, oh, I know, I said to them, well, what does a Canadian look like? I can't remember why I said it. And they all pointed at me. Nobody pointed at Pamela. And so after all that time, they still believed that a Canadian was white.
Yeah.
They didn't believe
And so,
that Canadian.
yeah. So we put back to them what, how many of you were born in Canada? And of course, their hands went up.
So for me, I always think of that is with the message that they repeatedly get to as who is defined as Canadian. And you know, the messages they get of who's defined as Canadian comes straight down from the Governor General all the way down to the teacher in the classroom and to the person who's driving. So I'm always, it was interesting when our new Governor General, when people were using language as a way of saying, her competence in French. But I always think that if we think about it, this person grew up in that area of Canada and did not learn French. So we have to think of, is it because of her or is it because of the system that she was engaged in that might have left that out of the education that she could have had? And I think that's so important when we start thinking of this, who is Canadian? And if you're Canadian, then you should be able to speak French and English, or are you just okay with just speaking French, or are you just okay in speaking English? You know, I was, this week I had to deal with a PhD dissertation from an African-Canadian student who had written a dissertation about Black students' experiences in Quebec. And she was talking, and I quote her, she said, while notions of race, racialization, or racism are contested concepts and pose, she said, a significant challenge for scholars carrying out work in the Canadian-speaking society, she said, it is necessary for her as a Black woman to build an airtight theoretical foundation to be able to speak about what she's talking about, because she do not think she has to, because she's seen as not Canadian, despite being of African background from Nova Scotia, those many years of living in Canada. She needed to build an airtight case if people are going to take her seriously and take the work that she provides seriously. And again, it's where those messages are coming from. And it gets back to the earlier point about if the messages come from the media as well. Why do you think an African American in New York, in Florida, no matter, might never be asked where that African American is from? An African Canadian is always asked where he or she or they are from. And that should tell you something about how the society builds who belongs here or who is from here and who is not from here. Yes, Jerry.
So, you know, what it brings up for me is the difference between intent and outcome. So the asking of the question, where are you from, might not have any kind of nefarious intent. But if I get asked that question all the time, that's very different from someone who never gets asked that question.
Yeah.
If someone says, where are you from? I say New York, end of story. But, you know, to me, it doesn't then relate to, does that mean that I don't belong or not? So it's all has to do with the context for me and the outcome, but it is a fascinating question and it's a great discussion for students. Because they will always say, I asked somebody where they're from and, you know, I was just curious. I just thought that they sounded so interesting. I just wanted to know. So, you know, they don't have any idea of the kind of outcome that it could have for some people. So part of that, I think, is educating people that that question could mean very different things for different people.
Yeah, and so what we talked about allyship. So allies will have to know all these kind of things. You know, if we're going to be good allies, we're going to have to understand how the lived experience and how our own lived experience and how we must come to terms with that, and how do we help bring into that discussion some of the points that we're raising today, or else I might be an ally, but I might not be the best because I do not pay attention to how those people are constructed. This is how the messages society gives to them and how it's constantly reproduced over and over again. And I could be indirectly reproducing the very thing that I'm trying to go against because I did not pay attention to how these things operate in my life and in their life.
I'm very conscious of the time, and it's coming up 2 o'clock. And so I just want to make a comment before I hand it over to Myrna to thank Carl. Lawrence Hill, in one of his early books, Blackberry Tuesday, says, from his own experience, it's not the question that causes the problem. It's the response to the answer. So where are you from? I'm from Toronto. That's it. But when the person goes on to say, yeah, but before Toronto, or where are your parents from, or where were you born? Those are the problematic questions. And so if anybody is interested in that chapter from Lawrence's book, we would be happy to send you a copy of the chapter. It's called The Question. Okay? And so Lawrence talks about the fact that he has a Black father, a white mother, and how people are really trying to find out who he is. He's even been asked, what are you? Yeah. So lots of food for thought. And before I hand it over to Myrna, I want to say, Carl, you've done a lot of work with us from the March 21st committee and the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center. We really appreciate that. Myrna?
Thanks very much for having me.
What a fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, we can talk for 3-4 hours, I believe. So it's really a very interesting topic. So thank you so much for on behalf of the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center. Thank you so much for the great presentation, for the great discussion, and congratulations again for the 2022 Killam Prize for the Social Sciences. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me and for engaging in this discussion. One of my greatest rewards in when I present is having discussion. That I always find that rewarding, and not just simply say, thanks very much, goodbye.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Carl, will you stay on for a moment?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
And listen, I want to tell you that your book has had such an influence on the students. As an American, part of the colonization process of taking an American university to Canada, the Canadian students, so much of our material is American, and your book has just had a huge influence on the students.
Thanks very much. I'm very, very glad I was able to help change that narrative that we keep reproducing.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Carl, will you send Sharanjeet your, you need his mail address, Sharanjeet, or something else?